Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm speaking with Dr Jennifer Fraser. Jennifer, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks so much for having me, Daniel.
Well, it's great to have you on. You've recently written a book, you've got an online program, you've got a TED Talk, you're doing loads of really interesting stuff in the world of bullying. The impact of bullying, the causes of bullying, the potential solutions we can go about in terms of bullying. But before we start talking about that, Jennifer, why don't you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience? Tell us about yourself. Who are you, what you're doing, and what you've been up to in your work.
Okay, well, I have a PhD in comparative literature, and that means that I've been trained to take different discourses and put them into dialogue. So in the last about 7 years of my work, I have been taking neuroscience as a kind of discourse or a lens of language that we can use to better understand ourselves and our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings, how we interact with one another. So I'm taking neuroscience and I'm putting it into the arena with bullying or verbal abuse and psychological abuse and sport and school and parenting, and really trying to examine ways that we can change how we handle it, essentially, because it's just so detrimental to our children and to the workplace and to all the things that we love, like learning and sports and all these things. So I've been an educator for the last 20 years. I'm an author. I've written 3 books now, and my 4th one, as you say, is hopefully going to be coming out soon. Yeah.
It feels a little bit of an interesting leap, having a PhD in comparative literature and being involved in the world of bullying and verbal abuse and helping educate the world about this horrible area. You also said you've been a teacher for a lot of your working life. So is that really how interest in this area emerged for you, being a teacher and perhaps maybe seeing things that you didn't necessarily like? Is that how it emerged?
Yeah, I was working at a private school, and what happened was, we always talk about bullying as if it's a children's issue, and somehow we're going to solve the epidemic by working with our children. And we have these things we say to them, if you're being bullied, go tell a teacher. We tell them not to be bystanders. We say you must be an upstander. And we also tell them that, we have zero tolerance for this kind of behavior. And then what happened to me as a teacher in this private school was it was like the blinders fell from my eyes, because what I realized is I went through a very elaborate process with first students who were reporting very extreme bullying being done to them, but it wasn't other students, the teachers. And it was in a sport context. It was in basketball. And then as I went through the various layers that you have to deal with when these things occur, I had legal duty as a teacher to report, for example, to the authorities. If we find out that students are being abused, we have to report. Same with you as a psychologist, obviously. So I did all of the things that I was supposed to do. I went to the headmaster and I went to the board and I spoke to ultimately the authorities, because the headmaster didn't file. I had to. And that it all ended up, and this is literally 2 years later. 2 years later, after a 6-month investigation, and then the teacher regulation, the head of the teacher regulation, he deliberated for a year and a half on the investigation materials, and he ended up at the end of all of this by victim blaming. He said that the students were too sensitive, and he said that they shouldn't have listened to the teacher's obscenities. And that's when I realized that everything that we say and do essentially is backwards.
The students were too sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
As in, the teacher was doing nothing wrong. This basketball coach was doing absolutely nothing wrong, and they shouldn't have taken what this basketball coach was saying to heart. Would that be sort of an accurate assessment of the verdict?
Well, it was stranger than that, because there was 13, 14 students had come forward, and they were, they had no history of complaining about teachers before. They were all passionate athletes. They, had never lied before. I mean, they had sort of, these kind of perfect character histories. And yet when they came forward and they said that they were being called homophobic slurs, they were being repeatedly sworn at, that was a total system of sort of threats and favoritism. Really, the coaches were very disinterested in winning. It was way more about being able to sort of put some students on pedestals and knock others down with very humiliating public shaming. One student reported being thrown against a wall. One student was repeatedly publicly shamed, and when he tried to get away, he was grabbed physically. I mean, it was just, I've never heard anything like it. The headmaster asked me to take testimonies, and I ended up taking 4 testimonies from boys and 4 testimonies from girls. I'd never done that kind of work before, and what struck me was how repetitive it was. So the boys ranged from grade 10 to grade 12, and they were reporting the same language, the same behavior, the same sort of, this pattern of verbal abuse, basically. And same thing with the girls. They ranged from second year university to grade 11. And so I realized in that moment, when an adult is suffering from this condition where they are using this type of treatment of children, behind closed doors, they can't break out of the cycle, essentially is what, I mean, maybe they believe in it and they believe it gets results, which is interesting in both cases because neither of these coaches were getting results. Or they're trapped by this kind of pattern. It's almost obsessive compulsive behavior where there's nothing creative, there's nothing original. It doesn't change with different teams or kids, or it's the same thing year in, year out. I mean, it's really a shame.
It's narrative and meaning for me, Jennifer. I mean, this is really interesting. And look, obviously this is the Sports Psych show, and I've heard you talk on another podcast and really loved what you had to say, and that's why I wanted to get you on the Sports Psych show, because this is so relevant for modern day sports. I know that your books, your work encompasses education and music and just life in general, but obviously being the Sports Psych show, we'll work together over the next 45-50 minutes to frame this within a sporting context as much as we can. And it's really interesting that your first experience, the reason you got into this, the reason you've written these books, it actually stems from a sporting experience, this basketball coach. And coming back to that notion of narrative and meaning, so often in sport, the narrative is, well, this is sport. This is sport, and sport is a metaphor for life, and the reason for participating in sport is to be tough for the rest of your life, is to toughen up for life, is to be able to go into the rest of your life and experience these challenging situations, and that's what sport is for. That tends to become the narrative, and you can only but wonder that this basketball coach, that becomes the narrative, and the meaning is very much tough for life. My job is to toughen up kids for life, for the trials and the tribulations that they're going to meet in life. That's kind of my interpretation sometimes of where these sports coaches go with their narrative and the meaning behind the narrative.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, it's a sort of self-talk. I mean, hearing you say that makes me think about, okay, well, what exactly is the person saying to themselves? So you know how you can have negative self-talk and put yourself down. Well, I think the coaching narrative that you're describing it's a very deep-seated belief system. It comes oftentimes, as you would know as a psychologist and a sports psychologist, it comes from how you were coached, and it comes from how you were parented probably as well. And lots of times, certainly in Canada, I don't know if this is true in England as well, but coaches will be parents. So if you have a double whammy of the parent and the coach treated you in a very humiliating, punishing, threatening way, you love your parent, you love your coach, you've grown up with these sort of role model adults, and what we know now from the neuroscience is your brain is is completely constructed to reflect that behavior. The mirror neurons in your brain are going to absorb that type of conduct, and then they're going to play it back out themselves when they grow up and when they enter into the world and they have social relationships. So, I mean, one of the big thrusts of my work is I want adults to understand, especially coaches and teachers, it's that we're the big influencers. We're the ones that, not so much what we say, but it's also how we behave, how we treat our students and our athletes. That is how they will behave, because we are the ones that project that onto them. They reflect it back. So if we have kids in our world that have a bullying problem that is so significant that we refer to it as an epidemic, we're never going to change it by focusing on the athletes. We have to look to the coaches. It's not the students. We have to look to the teachers, not the kids. We have to look to the parents. And that's where we're really going to make change.
You've written this book, The Bullied Brain, What Neuroscientists Know About Brain Scars and How to Heal Them. It's not out yet, but you also have an accompanying online course. So let's talk a little bit about the book, but let's also continue to relate this as closely as we can to what we've started to speak about there. And I think as you were talking, I was trying to put myself into the sneakers, if you like, of these coaches who might respond to you and say, yeah, but Jennifer, but Dr. Fraser, these kids have to know that life is tough. And so when I shout at them, when I make things tough for them, that's actually going to help them. When I raise my voice, I do so because I care about them, but they need to know life is going to be really, really difficult, and sport is difficult, and everything associated with their futures are difficult, so they need to know. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's interesting because, when you were talking about the book, you said I also try and look at different contexts. So I look at music, for example, and I take a look at the film Whiplash because it was such a brilliant portrayal of an abusive educator. And what I would say about the toughness piece is, and this is what I do when I give talks, I say, research shows that if a child is raised by a loving parent who creates as much protection around that child and as much challenge around that child in the form of scaffolding. So, that's the neuroscience word that they use, this, Carol Dweck's work, where she talks about how you want to constantly be giving this challenge that's pushing, this demanding piece where you keep saying, I believe you can go faster, and I believe you can last longer, and I believe you can jump higher and kick stronger. That is scaffolding, and it's very much a belief system. If your coach believes in you and yet never gives you challenges that are beyond your capacity, because that's where they start to demoralize you. That's where, if they then have to somehow tap into demeaning language or yelling or berating, these kinds of anger, aggression modes, the research shows that actually will shut the athlete down. That will make the athlete full of insecurity and, trigger in their brain a major fear response. And as soon as you're afraid, as you know, you can't concentrate. You can't focus. You can't achieve to your highest potential. Classic example of this that's used all the time is a kid in the spelling bee. They know the word inside out, but they're so terrified by being on a public stage with a microphone in front of them, or that they're going to make a mistake and fail, that they can no longer spell the word. And this is you would deal with this all the time. This is a block. It happens to athletes where a performance block. And lots of times when you trace back to, why do you have this block, as you unravel it, it's because they're so afraid of making a mistake and being humiliated or being benched or being blocked from what they love, which is their sport. You're getting to the heart of, okay, well, maybe that's not the best coaching method.
It's interesting, and I'm actually going to quote from your book, because you mentioned sort of anxiety and stress, and you say in the book, extensive research shows that a stressed brain, one that has spiking cortisol, which is your stress hormone, fails to learn anything productively. It can't concentrate. It can't remember. It isn't generating new brain cells. its neurons are dying, its hippocampus is shriveling. There is no way it's attaining greatness. It may appear to react in fear to the abuse, and a stopgap protective response like running away from a long term. It is not learning or performing at its best. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because whilst these coaches might say, well, I want to create this tough environment, I'll use tough language, if they were to put themselves inside the brain of their players, of their participants, they potentially experience change that diminishes the ability to learn, the ability to perform.
Yeah, I think that's the heart of the matter. And I just, as I completed this one course on transform bullying with neuroscience, I've also done another course that speaks very specifically to this. And it's, if there's coaches listening to this and they're feeling that sense of, well, how am I supposed to know about the brain? How am I supposed to be coaching to the brain when none of us have been taught that material? I mean, I've been doing for the last 7 years my own research into this. I took a course on applied neuroscience. I took another course at University of Denver on neuroscience in the classroom. I've been reading every single book I can get my hands on. But the bottom line is it's a crash course I'm doing by myself over the last 7 years because I've never been taught anything about brains as an educator. And it's really amazing to me now when I look back because, this is just a side anecdote, but I gave a talk in Orlando to the heads of sport organizations across the U.S. And I started out, they were very worried about me talking about neuroscience. And, I had my PowerPoint and the whole thing. And I was just saying, you know what? It's okay. We can talk about the brain. It's not written in stone. We don't have to say this is some sort of a gospel that we're going to follow. But there is a ton of research from the last 20 years that is replicated and peer-reviewed. And we really need to know it if we're working with children and adolescents in particular. And so I said to these about 250 head sport organizations, and I said, if you can name 5 parts of the body, put your hand up and tell me its essential function. Every hand in the room goes up. And then I said, can you tell me 5 parts of the brain and what its essential function is? And no hands went up. And so I said to them, that's why today we're going to talk about the brain. I mean, we say in sports, it's a mental game. Well, then if it's a mental game, and we don't really know much about the organ that's in control of that mental game, then we all have some exciting learning ahead of us, basically. So this is a roundabout way of answering what we were just talking about, which is if a coach wants to toughen up an adolescent in particular, and we know that kids are quitting sports, 7 out of 10 kids quit sports at the start of adolescence, at 13. So we really need to ask ourselves why that is. And it might be a variety of factors, but I'm quite sure that one of the factors is the adolescent brain is hypersensitive. It is geared to become completely sensitized to facial expressions, tone of voice. They will misinterpret an adult speaking sternly as the adult is in a rage against them. They will misinterpret shock as anger. Their brains have been primed by evolution and endocrinology to get out of the parental cage, walk away from the community and the tribe, and find another tribe. And so they've got to know how to pick up on the other tribes, slight nuances and expressions and so on, and how they use their voices, and because that's the only way they're going to survive. And so what happens to our 21st century adolescents is they come up against adults who don't know this. So the adult is, yelling and gesticulating, and worst of all, using any type of shaming, public shaming or humiliation, or any kind of ostracizing where the young person feels like they don't belong to the team, or they're being punished by not being allowed, by being benched, let's say, or whatever. These are the kinds of things that are particularly damaging to the adolescent brain. At the age of 24, 25, we have an adult brain, and it's not nearly so serious. But if you want to coach teenagers and young people, really to know about how to work with the adolescent brain is going to help you be a much more successful coach.
So, for those coaches who do work with the teenage brain, what kind of things do they need to look out for? What kind of things do they need to think about? What do they need to consider going into their sessions? What do they need to consider going into their activities?
Well, I think one of the best books I've read on this idea of how to work with adolescents is The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle. And what he talks about, he went and looked at talent hotbeds all over the world. So he was looking at a lot of coaches and a lot of programs in different countries. And what he found was he found three consistent things that led to a talent hotbed. And the first thing was ignition. And ignition meant that the person, the athlete, had to believe in themselves. So a coach that wants to get buy-in from young people needs to make them believe in themselves. And this is confirmed by other research being done on Olympic athletes, where they found that the Olympic athletes that win medals, I mean, they're all talented athletes. They all have unbelievable coaches, but the ones that win medals have coaches that make them believe in themselves. Regardless of mistakes or illness or injury, the coach never stops this incredible funneling of belief into the athlete. And so all of us as coaches can do that with young people. So ignition is the first thing. The second thing is, and coaches would know this well, it's deliberate practice. So what they find is that when an athlete is doing, oftentimes they try and make it smaller. So, 5-on-5 soccer or 3-on-3 basketball, because it allows the athlete to try a movement, make a mistake, and then slight corrections, and the coach giving slight, very empathic corrections, where the coach is highly aware of each individual athlete and how to communicate with them, because we're all so different. We all have different brains. And the sensitized coach is going to, rather than yelling and carrying on, it's the one that can actually communicate in the style best associated with each individual athlete that's going to get the results and the achievement that they want. And what happens is you myelinate your neural networks. So every single time an athlete is doing a movement over and over again with slight corrections and encouragement and having, making mistakes, which is how the brain learns, and never being shamed for a mistake, that'll shut down learning. You have to celebrate mistakes when you're a coach, because that's the brain learning. And then the third thing is just pure and simple coaching. And when Daniel Coyle talks about coaches that lead talent hotbeds, he doesn't talk about anybody humiliating or toughening up or yelling or berating. There's none of that. He talks about coaches who are so well versed in the sport, and they're so attuned with each individual athlete that they can, he talks even about how their eyes, they look into the eyes of the athlete and they can reach them and capture them wherever that athlete is in their stage. And of course, John Wooden is the most famous coach for his empathic approach to athletes, and he had unbelievable success.
As you're speaking there, I'm putting together some of the things you've said so far, and what I hear, a potential response to those coaches who tend to wood the demeaning side of things at times, or the shouty side of things. You mentioned Carol Dweck earlier, you mentioned challenge, the importance of providing challenge for not just young players, but players of any age. So challenge is important. Add to that deliberate practice. And that comes in quite a few flavours, and there's sort of agreement and disagreement across the community as to what that looks like. But challenge, deliberate practice. And then, as you articulated there, coaching. Challenge, deliberate practice, lay down a challenge, help players engage, help participants engage in deliberate practice, and coach them. And coach them optimally, coach them effectively. And ultimately, Jennifer, that seems to be a more adaptive formula for helping people grow, helping people develop, than the shouty, demeaning drill sergeant standing by the pitch.
Well, I totally find that well expressed and well researched. Where I struggle to find any information at all, any peer-reviewed, any replicated, any kind of research or study anywhere that suggests that yelling and berating and humiliating and threatening will get results. I just can't find it. So when I come up against, debate about this, I think it's something that athletic directors and other coaches can do too, is really coming together as a group and saying, okay, let's, if we're going to have a discussion about this, let's back up our points with, some really solid research. And I mean, I don't know if you've read studies in the psychology realm, sports psychology, that can make a really convincing argument and can show that results come with that particular approach that, many people my age have been trained in. We were trained to believe that this type of toughening up is going to produce greatness. And I mean, in our society, all we have to do is look to politics to see that while we, out one side of our face, we tell our children, putting people down, humiliating them, swearing, using foul language, all of these things are completely unacceptable. But then you look to politics, and these people are the leaders of our countries. And they are, in the most prestigious and most powerful position. And you see them very publicly using that type of behavior. It's not as though they have to cover it up. It's not as if they're ashamed to be using it. And it's also not stopped. So I think it's that divide in society where I think our children are very confused. I think they replicate the behavior of adults. I think adults are struggling to figure out, how do they fit on this spectrum. I call it the bullying and abuse paradigm, and I see it very much as a framework. And my goal and purpose is to try and change that mindset, because I think it's very locked in for quite a number of people. And I want to change the mindset to what I call the neuro paradigm. And the neuro paradigm is about using research. I can back up everything I say with extensive neuroscience and psychology and positive psychology. I can psychiatric studies, whatever you want. I've got a stack of research a mile high that supports what I'm trying to say about if you want results, if you want athletes to stay playing sports past 13, if you want to absolutely train young people to be athletes for life and develop them, even if you don't win every game and it doesn't fuel your ego. If you want to be that person, here's all the research that backs up how important and effective it is for their brains.
To answer your question, I don't know of any research that backs up threat, bullying, shouting at people correlated to or any kind of causality with high performance. I suppose that some coaches would look to experiential evidence. So in America, they might cite a Bobby Knight. In the UK, somebody might cite Sir Alex Ferguson. And in the popular press, when you watch sports and a team is way down at half time, they'll be saying, this team will be going in and getting the hairdryer treatment, as they might have said with Sir Alex Ferguson. And this is I'm speaking here, and I'm absolutely not having a go at somebody who is regarded as one of the greatest managers in modern day soccer and soccer historically. But that tends to be maybe the popular press fuel it, TV fuels it. I think coaches might hang on to certain experiential evidence. With that in mind, Jennifer, may I ask, what kind of pushback have you had when you've delivered these presentations? Have you had overt pushback? What have coaches said?
It's funny. I don't get pushback. I get more worry. So at the end of a talk, I'll have people come up and say to me, I'm a bit of a yeller. Am I hurting, and sometimes it'll be parents, am I hurting my kid's brain? And I will say no. Because, I don't know any parents who haven't yelled at their kids. I don't know any teacher who hasn't lost it or any coach who hasn't lost it. That's not bullying. It's bullying behavior. That's what I described to you before, where it's relentless, it's repeated, and it has no correlation with performance. Bullying, let's look at kids. So when you were talking about that coach who might be, pretty rough language, pretty tough, but it's not bullying because it's not targeting a single athlete or a small group of athletes while it privileges other ones. It's not using favoritism, therefore. It's probably not using humiliation. Toughness and humiliation are two different things. One is demanding and one is demeaning. And as you said before, there's no demeaning methods that make people perform better. Short term maybe, but long term absolutely not. What you do find is people, they just walk away from a sport that they used to love, even though it used to be their lifeblood. They'll walk away because they can't stand the negative associations with abuse. So what I find is people are worried about how they work with kids, and unless you are truly bullying, where you've created a system that's like a bully on the playground. So a kid who gets into an argument with a kid on the playground, or is rough, or is using strong language, or any of these things, even gets into fisticuffs, let's say, we would never call that bullying. That's an interpersonal clash of some kind that's happening that a parent might have with a kid, a coach might have with a player who's being rude, whatever, or not performing, not trying, and trying to get to the heart of it, or trying to motivate them in some way. Bullying is different. It's when you have a kid on the playground who hones in on a child for no apparent reason and tries to destroy their sense of selfhood. And even though people don't like to hear this and it's very taboo, teachers certainly don't want to talk about it, and I don't think coaches do either, there are some adults out there that is how they approach their coaching or their teaching or their parenting. They take kids down. And that's what really comes to me, and that's really where you see the research showing that you get long-term, very serious brain damage from that. We have a legal system that privileges sexual abuse and physical abuse, but if you look at the research, the neuroscience, it will tell you that emotional abuse is just as severe for the brain.
Interesting. I've watched Whiplash. I really enjoyed the film. And you've written about it in the book. I enjoyed the film. Perhaps let me go back on that slightly. It was an emotional roller coaster ride for me. I am engaged in mastery. Have been since I was a wannabe professional golfer, through being a professional golfer, being a golf coach, through to being a sports psychologist for the last 15 years. And a lot of my world, a lot of my life, a lot of my thoughts are about mastery. And so I was really excited to watch the film. What's your thoughts on the film? What's your thoughts on what you saw?
Well, I found the film incredibly interesting as well because I come at it from the different perspective where I look at how does somebody, destroy potential for mastery in another human being, somebody who's in their control. Bullying depends a lot on the person having control over you. And there's no greater control than a teacher or a coach. So it's very interesting to me. So, and I found it interesting too because he presents himself, the music teacher, as the typical, Mike Rice abusive coach figure, or the kinds of coaching that Jordan McNair, the football player at University of Maryland, endured. And what I find really interesting is you have the drummer responds to it by playing a very brilliant drum solo. But the film isn't called anything from jazz. It isn't called anything from music, and it isn't called anything that suggests mastery. The film is called Whiplash, and a whiplash is an invisible injury to the brain and to the neck and to the body. And I know that the writer of the film and the director of the film, Damien Chazelle, was modeling and exploring this issue because he had a very abusive music teacher. So he doesn't call his film mastery. He calls it whiplash. And I found that really profound because I feel like we're making a big breakthrough with concussions. So we used to think that if an athlete had a concussion, they were fine because we couldn't see the injury. And we're a very primitive people in a sense, human beings. If we can't see that smoke is blackening the lungs, we didn't know that it was causing cancer. But technology allowed us to see that. If we couldn't see into the brain and know that a concussion was actually doing pretty serious damage to the brain, same thing with verbal abuse, psychological abuse, and emotional abuse. It's doing very serious damage to the brain. Because we can't see it, we're not alarmed, we're not worried. But now that we have non-invasive brain scans and we can look in and look at the whiplash, we can look at the concussion, and we can look at, those descriptors you gave of what happens to bullied brains. That the memory center of the brain, the hippocampus is shriveled, brain cells start to die, neurons. They're not connecting and generating more and learning new things. They can see withering, neurological scars, these sorts of things. I really feel that there's such responsibility on our part as educators, whether we're teachers or coaches, to know this new information, because the policymakers and the lawyers and the lawmakers, they're dragging their feet. This is not, the governments aren't sending out big warnings. We're starting to have a little bit around concussions. You're starting to see some laws and sort of rules here and there, and much more medical sense on the side of coaches and their understanding of how serious it is for the brain, but it's just not fast. I mean, I feel a lot of urgency around it.
It's interesting because you actually mentioned in your book the part where, and I think it happened a few times in the film, they showed Andrew Neiman, who is the drummer, the young drummer, his hands bleeding, and jazz musicians have said, well, this isn't true, this doesn't happen, no matter how hard you practice the drums, your hands don't bleed. And you wonder if was it Damien Chazelle, the writer and director, used it as a kind of a form of imagery for bleeding hands, bleeding mind, essentially.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's so important you said that, because of course at the very, very heart of that film, at the center of that film, is Andrew doesn't commit suicide. He does a great jazz solo on his drums. But another student commits suicide from this treatment. And it goes back to this idea of switching up your coaching depending on who you're talking to, because you don't know the history of the kid you're talking to. You don't know if that kid suffers from constant bullying at home from a parent or sibling. You don't know if the kid is got suicidal ideation already from something else. You just don't know. What you really want to do is find out, and is have that kind of really caring, connected relationship with your athletes, because you just don't know. So you could cause one of your players to play better by pushing them in a very aggressive, maybe even humiliating way. I mean, that's explored with Andrew and Terrence Fletcher. But you could also cause a kid to really, really suffer in terrible ways. And I guess we have to weigh out, considering that suicide is the leading or the second leading cause of death in our youth populations. It goes back to what I was saying about the adolescent brain. Clearly, we need to know more about how the brain is developing up to the age of 24, 25 when they become adults, because they are taking their own lives. That is as strong a statement of suffering as Damien Chazelle using the bleeding hands in his film.
Your book is separated into two parts, and the second part, healing brain scars, and you talk about empathy as a way to heal brain scars. Can you talk to us a little bit about empathy and its importance?
Well, I think one of the best studies of empathy is Jeremy Rifkin's Empathic Civilization. And there's a lot of significant work by, so for example, a psychiatrist at Harvard University, Helen Reese, and it's really quite amazing what empathy does for the brain. It's incredibly good for it. And so one of the people that uses it very specifically in sport is George Mumford. And George Mumford, as I'm sure you know, he's written The Mindful Athlete. And he's worked with, Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan. And they would attribute their amazing success to him. And of course to Phil Jackson, but really to him, because what he taught them was the opposite of the anxiety-ridden player who's always so worried that they're going to make a mistake and be ashamed, so they overthink everything and they have these performance blocks. The opposite of that are these highly empathic athletes who are totally connected to their coach. They're totally connected to each other. The coach doesn't even need to yell at them because they know what the coach is thinking and what he's feeling or she's feeling. And it's this incredible sort of this ability to understand other people's minds and your own mind in such a higher level way that you attain what Csikszentmihalyi calls flow. And it's time disappears, everything disappears. The crowd's not there. It's just you and your coach and your team and the game. And when you hit that state, it's just a whole higher level of mastery. And it's really, I mean, if you want to go back to X's and O's, that's where you see brilliant athleticism as well.
Related to empathy, something you write about in the book, and I'll quote you here: one of the best ways to access brain capacity is to foster group and peer connectivity, which I thought was great. How can group and peer connectivity heal the brain? How can it help people move on from bullying?
Well, that's a really great question, because one of the most fascinating things to me is Dr. John Ratey's book, Spark, where he talks about how one of the greatest ways to heal a brain that has been suffering is through exercise. So it's all that more reason why we want to keep our athletes empathic, so that they're full of care, essentially, and attunement with each other and attunement with their coach and even the other players. I mean, it's that heightened sense of, what's actually unfolding here. You're so alive, you're so aware, and you're so present. There's none of that, again, as we said, the stressed out brain that's overthinking and overanalyzing and feeling ashamed and, being pulled in all these different directions by all of these, stress hormones and anxieties and so on. So the connectivity piece it can be fostered by any coach. Any coach who starts out a practice by bringing their athletes together and taking some time out for mindfulness, get them all to slow down and ground themselves in their bodies, have them do the deep breathing required to lower stress hormones and raise up all of the positives that the brain needs, and get them to be in such a calm and trusting state, and take them through a guided meditation on connectivity, and then talk to them about how, the practice that's going to unfold is going to be all about myelinating the neural networks that the team needs to achieve at their top peak. The thing that I love so much about it is Dr. John Medina, a neuroscientist in the US, he's written in support of one of my projects, and what I loved was he said in his letter, teenagers, for the most part, young people, are a very underserved population, and the remedies that we can all put into place to help them don't cost anything. And that's mindfulness and meditation, that's empathy training, empathy facilitation, and exercise. Those are the three big, huge things. Well, and then I guess the fourth would be positive psychology, where you teach having the research, as you would know, the research on a positive mindset is unbelievable in terms of how much it results in peak performance.
Wow, yes, when you speak of positive psychology, I think of the work of Professor Barbara Friedrichsen and the importance of having three positive thoughts or reflecting on three positive things to one, say, negative thing. Just, having a weighting towards the positive, towards the helpful, towards the constructive. I mean, as a psychologist, as a sports psychologist, I'm not necessarily talking about positive thinking all the time. I actually refer more towards flexible thinking, but it's having that flexi approach away from the unhelpful towards the helpful, away from the destructive towards the constructive. I just think is so important, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm. Yes, totally. Whichever the language, and that flexibility of mind is so connected to flexibility of body too, and flexibility of belief. If you have a flexible belief that with work, with effort, you can achieve anything you want, which is what the research shows, sky's the limit.
And I just think, just dwelling on that fostering group and peer connectivity, just as you've been speaking, I've been reflecting on some of if people follow me at all on social media or read some of my I was going to say rants there, but they're not rants. I try to be persuasive articles, try to write persuasive articles. On that subject of fostering group and peer connectivity, I just think that in sport we've been so socialized into individual responsibility. I think coaches have become somewhat obsessed over the years in terms of saying, I demand attitude, I demand effort, I demand energy, I demand coachability, I demand this, I demand that. You can control your attitude. And these kind of very simplistic maxims. And it's stop, hold on, think. Human beings can't control some of these things. We experience anxiety, we experience stress, we experience low mood. Low mood happens to us, lethargy happens to us. Our biology drives how we feel and what we experience. And one can't simply insist. I just wonder sometimes if demeaning bullying can come from coaching frustrations because of these traditional coaching maxims that are so basic, they're so simplistic. And coach education really has to go past those to understand we are neurological, we are biological creatures. We experience stressors. So we as coaches have to be better equipped to help people become better managers of their attitude, better managers of their effort. We have to coach mental skills. We have to coach life skills. We have to coach these things rather than simply demand them, because that just leads possibly to maladaptive coaching behaviours.
When you say that, it reminds me of the origin of the word to coach. And I don't know if you know this, but I looked it up for an article I was writing, and I was like, where does it come from? Because being a very literary person, I love words and sort of what they meant in history. And the word to coach originally came from students at Oxford and tutors. And the tutors saw themselves literally as a kind of coach that would carry the student, on wheels, like a coach carrying a student through his or her exams. And I guess it would have been his exams back in the day. So it was really this idea of, hey, I've got all this knowledge in my head, so I can act as the vehicle for you. I can support you and carry you through something that's really, really challenging. And that original idea, I find really, it should help coaches understand that when they're confronted with an athlete who has low attitude for whatever reason on a day, or is not showing their usual effort, or they might be distracted, or any of these things, if the coach thought of themselves more of that original deep meaning to the word, where it's their job then to somehow carry them through, then they will be doing much more what Daniel Coyle found in the talent hotbeds, which is that these coaches were they were always in a state of kind of care, essentially, and they were able to inspire their athletes so that they never believed that the talent was something that an athlete was born with or just had or whatever. They always felt that their job was to grow the talent, and that's the word he uses. Talent, you're not born with talent. It's the coach that helps you grow it. And if we approached individual athletes or games or teams in this way, I think that there would be a pleasing, response on the part of the young people you're working with, because everybody who feels supported and understood and cared for and believed in is much more likely to try a lot harder.
I also think if we use the analogy of coaches as transport, as carrier, as carriage, as driver, essentially, we can also say that it's the job of that driver to ask where that person wants to go. And potentially, and I don't want to stretch the analogy too much here, but potentially what sights they want to see on the way. Because I think it is about coach having expertise and distributing their knowledge. But it's also, as coach, the capacity to help somebody self-learn as well. It's about helping somebody uncover where they want to go and how far they can go, and also enjoy that journey, essentially self-learn and improve in their own manner. And you can only do that with empathy. You can only do that when you're almost like a servant leader, where you're saying, actually, as your coach, as your leader, I'm not going to shout at you, I'm not going to berate you, I'm not going to demean you, I'm not going to belittle you. I'm here to help you, I'm here to serve you. How can I get you from point A to point B? What little things can we discover us discover together on this journey that can help us both enjoy the journey and get to where we both want to go.
I totally agree. I think that right there is the game changer. Just even that language, that mindset of saying, just that idea of togetherness. We're in this together. I'm not in the position of authority or control. I'm not brandishing my power for all to see and, yelling out these directives and telling other people how powerful I am. I mean, if that is the way that we get performance in the workplace or in the arts or in sport or anything, then really you would expect to see that much more on the professional level where you're dealing with the absolute best of the best, but you just don't see that kind of behavior. You see very connected athletes and coaches or employees and true servant leaders working together.
As you mentioned earlier, the dropout rate in sport, the opposite of what we're talking about here is that bullying culture, and that's potentially where you get the professionalisation of youth sport, and that's where you get the dropout, and that's not an optimal experience for young people and adults alike. I think we're in agreement there, aren't we?
I think that's a really big indicator to all of us that really, if we want kids to be healthy and if we want them to have incredibly healthy brains for their academics, well, the best thing that they can do is be fit. And so the fact that we have such a high dropout rate means all people coaching, all athletic directors, sports psychologists should be leading the way. We just need to press reset. And I think we can do it, but it is a matter of, there's nothing I love better than being able to sort of sit down with an organization, work with a group of coaches, work with athletes, and get them to understand exactly what we've talked about today, that there's a ton of research out there now. It's pretty new, but it allows us to better understand how to work with brains and not harm them.
Now, talking about that research, this book, the Bullied Brain, isn't out yet, but I know you've got an online course that's very popular, and you've got other books you've written. So how can people find your course, find your books, and most importantly, find you on social media?
Well, for a lot of this work, you can find me on Twitter at Teaching Bullies. And I'm playing on that idea that, it's adults, it's us. We teach kids bullying, role model it, and then we tell them not to do it. So I tell the story in my book, which is available on Amazon. It's called Teaching Bullies. And I tell the story of what happened 7 years ago, how I got pulled into this bullying situation being done by teachers at the school I was working at. And I just basically put the story, the personal story, in the context of extensive psychological, psychiatric, and neuroscientific research. So that's kind of the main part of the work. I have a website, which is neuro, as in brain, so neuro paradigm. And I can send you the link so that we can make it more clear. It's sort of my husband was telling me it's a terrible name for a website.
I'm sure it's not.
Nobody will know how to spell it. Nobody knows what it means. It's a terrible name for a website. But my passion is such that I want it to become a household word, this idea of neuro paradigm. We've got to leave the bullying and abuse paradigm, enter into the new one that's completely grounded in caring for our brains, our children's brains. And our brains are so miraculous. I think it's a very exciting new way to be in the future.
That's brilliant. Fantastic. Well, I really enjoyed looking through that book, and I know when it does come out that people are going to really, really enjoy it. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on the Sports Psych Show. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan.
Well, everyone, that was Dr. Jennifer Fraser. Wasn't that fantastic? I really did enjoy that conversation, and I would like to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'll be delighted to hear them. Well, I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.